DIY.
Shout out to Producer Culture. They have two clips here. The first one is from Young Guru, one of the most legendary engineers. I, like many people, first heard of Young Guru from working with Jay-Z. He says something really interesting about how we should approach mixing, especially when we're learning what all of these different tools may do to help our music. It's important that we have a little bit of control when adding these things. The caption reads, "Do stuff with a purpose, not just to show off." What do you mean, Young Guru?
Not everything requires a plugin. Not everything needs to be EQ'd. Not everything needs to be compressed. Do stuff with purpose and with a meaning, not just to show off. And I guess that's my biggest thing. Like, really constantly remind yourself that the listener does not know anything about what we're doing in the studio. All they hear is the music that comes out of the two speakers. So that should be primary.
How many times have you heard a record in which you had contact with the artist or the producer or the engineer that made it? You ask them a very simple question. Why are the vocals so low? And the engineer goes into this long spiel about all of the elements that contributed to them making that decision. Well, it was because some of the sounds were conflicting with the tone of the voice of the artist. We were kind of putting everything together, and so I chose to use this one compressor, which someone told me would glue it all together really well, and I kind of went a little bit heavy on it. And as they're explaining their process, you're just sitting there clueless. Not that you don't know the terminology, but clueless as to why did they go so deep to accomplish a sound that doesn't sound good as an end result.
Not everything requires a plugin. Not everything needs to be EQ'd. Not everything needs to be compressed.
I know I'm guilty of it, especially when I started to learn new techniques. When I first started to understand a little bit about what compression could do, what compression sounds like when there's too much added, what it sounds like when there's not enough added, I found myself overusing it in ways that I thought, oh, this must be the professional way.
Do stuff with purpose and with a meaning, not just to show off.
What I've learned from having different engineer friends of mine that were transparent about their process, every session comes along with its own set of obstacles that they must make wise decisions upon how to attack. And there's not a one size fits all for every single recording experience, especially as new instruments are introduced, especially as new vocal tones are introduced. So it's important that you're able to take a step back as an engineer and ask yourself, what does this particular song really need?
Not everything requires a plugin. Not everything needs to be EQ'd. Not everything needs to be compressed.
That goes back to the example earlier where I was talking about having an engineer go through this weird rant about what made them end up at the end result. They forgot about the most important part of the process, how the listener's going to feel about it.
Constantly remind yourself that the listener does not know anything about what we're doing in the studio. All they hear is the music that comes out of the two speakers. So that should be primary.
They forgot about the experience that matters most, that they are doing all of this preparation and cleaning up for the listener. And obviously every single listener's experience is going to vary, whether they're listening to it on cheap headphones, whether they're listening to it in a stock car system or a system with sound. The decisions that you make that affect all of those are probably the ones you want to pay the most attention to, but it seems like those are the ones that are easiest to ignore. Because once you go deep down the rabbit hole, now you're adding other things to fix the things that you added. So this next slide is from Tizio, and he says, you don't need to put 8 billion plugins on everything. Somebody need to hear that message.
A lot of people think that mixing is complicated, like, oh, you got to use the crazy plugins. Like, sometimes you just need to use something simple because there's not a problem to fix. You know, like a lot of things people think, like when you're looking at a mix, you're looking at all the problems. Sometimes something is not an issue. Sometimes doesn't need anything but a little touch of compression just to kind of set it in the mix. But you don't need to put 8 billion plugins on everything with, you know, saturation on the hi-hat and all this stuff when it doesn't necessarily need it. You know what I mean? So I keep my stuff real simple. I go, the go-tos are...
Sometimes less is more.
Less is more sometimes.
I'll make an analogy right now. That's going to get me in trouble with my Christian friends. I don't care. I love y'all. You know I come with love when I say this. A brand new engineer reminds me of a born-again Christian. Not all of them, but a certain type that I know you've come in contact with. The one who is exposed to a new message, a new way of doing things. They're so excited by the energy and so excited by the feeling that they got to tell everybody. But it's not the telling that's the issue. It is the somewhat aggressive nature about making sure that everybody abides by that truth, or we cannot move on until you agree with everything that I say and everything that I experienced firsthand. That is engineers who get to learn about something, especially on YouTube. The moment you bring a compressor out, you get 15 compressor evangelists come out of nowhere and tell you how you are sinning in the many ways of mixing by pumping up your attack so fast, by pushing your output so aggressive. You are creating mixing blasphemy, according to them. And typically it's folks who just learned what a compressor is, and their favorite engineer gave them a tutorial, and they're gonna run with that gospel, and that's all they got. They haven't even had time to get past the honeymoon phase where you really start to learn about this new lifestyle that you took it on and the many commitments that come along with it and the things that you'll learn about yourself in the process.
A lot of people think that mixing is complicated, like, oh, you got to use the crazy plugins. Like, sometimes you just need to use something simple because there's not a problem to fix.
There's a lot of engineers, I think, that go by this ideology that more is better. You get every single plugin that you can find. You go through every single tutorial on YouTube, ignoring the fact that every engineer, every content creator, every producer has a different approach that were the result of good habits and bad habits. So when you take a combination of everything that kind of sounds good to you and you don't test it out in theory for your particular sound or your music, and you combine it before you actually see what aligns more with what your goal is sonically, you end up with a clusterfuck of everybody's good and everybody's bad. You end up with a clusterfuck of that.
You don't need to put 8 billion plugins on everything with saturation on the hi-hat and all this stuff when it doesn't necessarily need it.
And people wonder why they can't quite get their mixes to sound like their favorite engineer or their favorite producer. I have a theory that I think it comes down to you don't have a good understanding of why. You have determined your own why. You have combined the ideologies of all these different engineers and producers, and you don't know why their approach is the way it is. Some engineers may come from a hardware background, so they put a different emphasis on different parts of the mixing process. Some may come from an all-digital background, and that changes so many decisions in the process. Some may come from a rock background, and the idea of pumping sounds like the bass past the red is just like, no, you don't do it. But in hip hop, some of these things are norm, and some of these things are looked at as just expressing an emotion.
So I keep my stuff real simple. The go-tos are
sometimes less is more.
Less is more sometimes.
So it's very important that you mix with your ears, not just your eyes. Mix with the feel. Sit back and think about all these decisions that I made, all these plugins, which may all be A1. Do they all need to be at this show tonight? All of these compressors are top 10, but the top 10 compressors don't need to be in at the same time. That's how you make a good thing turn into a very shitty thing.
People think like when you're looking at a mix, you're looking at all the problems. Sometimes something is not an issue. Sometimes doesn't need anything but a little touch of compression just to kind of set it in the mix.
Sometimes you just need a touch of something. Sometimes you just need to crank it just a little bit. I think it was Leslie Brosthwaite. He talked about how he'll add 2 different compressions to a vocal chain. And the first one, he's like, I'll barely even notice it, but it gives me a level of security to know that it's there and not all of the weight is falling on the second compressor in this vocal chain. Why he wants that is something that only he understands. Why you're doing that?
You sure about that?
That's something that you're going to have to explain. Some people volunteer to want to mix my records, and I've had people that come to me and say, oh man, Curtis, your drums is too loud, your bass is this, da-da-da-da. I could just really make it sound clean. And I don't think they understand clean is not always the best approach sonically to what certain sounds are trying to accomplish. There's always room for improvement. I'm never above improvement, but some engineers are so great at mixing clarity, mixing out the mud, mixing out the dirty. They mix it so clean. They're almost like Mike from Breaking Bad, the guy that you would call in to clean up a murder scene because he was a former cop and he knew how to clean up a murder scene very, very cleanly. That's what some of these engineers are. Only issue is that they're not just cleaning out the bad in the mix, they're also cleaning out the soul. They're taking the low end out of the vocal, the bassiness, the warmth that somebody hears when they hear a certain vocal. They're taking out the punchiest part of the 808. And maybe for really great decisions because they're saying how it distorts with the kick. But they're not thinking for a second, could that distortion evoke an emotion out of the listener who don't know no better? And would I even give myself the opportunity to see if that's a thing? Well, the engineers that take that chance end up influencing future decisions of these artists or these engineers and these producers who only go by the book. You cannot deny how important experience plays a role in these. There are so many different circumstances that have given them permission to try different things. I got away with that mix without having to add these 3 or 4 things on a chain that I usually added. Let me try it again. Now you have reference points when you come across different obstacles where engineers that are only going by the book, they have no other, I don't know what to do. The engineers that have created their own book of mistakes, their own book of experience, their own catalog, they're able to pull back and say, a few years ago, I had this song that was giving me the same muddy issue. We tried doing this. Let me see if that works here. Those are my favorite engineers to listen to, are the ones who don't forget this is an active experience. And if you're going into autopilot as you're engineering, I think you can miss out on continuing to bring life to something that the artist and the producer have contributed so much energy into. If the engineers at the end of that assembly line, they can literally rob it of its life when they're doing it the wrong way. Those are my opinions. What do you guys think? Let me know.
DIY.
DIYers, if you enjoyed this content, make sure that you hit the like button and maybe even consider subscribing. Come on, man. Stop being greedy. Peace.